we're going to kick off then on day one with artificial intelligence. And the name of this session is Silver Bullet or Double-Edged Sword. So we want to get into the nitty-gritty of how you might use AI in your world of sustainability, because it's already transforming industries, as we know, and sustainability is no exception. So we're going to dig into some examples, I guess, of how AI is being used. And there's obviously a few elephants in the room with AI, the energy demand of it. But we want to look at some of the upsides as well and the trade-offs. Apparently, training a single large language model can emit as much CO2 as 5 cars over their lifetime. So there's plenty to discuss, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dexter Galvin, who is an independent advisor, but obviously formerly with CDP, was their Chief Commercial Officer. Welcome, Dexter.
Thank you.
Great.
Good to see you.
Indeed. For those that don't know who you are, why don't you give us just a quick background on what you've been up to, basically?
Yeah. I'm still getting used to introducing myself as an independent advisor, having spent 16 years at CDP. I helped to set up CDP's supply chain work, and I led that for a very long time. And just finished up at CDP in November. At the moment, however, I am advising a lot of climate data startups. I'm helping an organization called CO2 AI, headquartered in Paris, who are sitting at the nexus of climate action and artificial intelligence. I'm also advising in the private equity space, and will be joining a large supply chain sustainability organization to be announced next week. So I can't say who that is yet, but yeah.
Watch this space.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. But my journey on AI started back in 2020, still at CDP. BCG brought me into a couple of really interesting projects where we're really just thinking about the early days, how this might be applied in the climate space. So did some really cool work with Accenture on primary emissions data modeling. And we also did some really cool work with Google on activities to reduce emissions and how you could use the existing data out in the world to help companies identify what activities to reduce emissions they could undertake. So exciting stuff in the AI space. Then joined the advisory board of an organization called AI for the Planet. And we were meeting quite a lot for quite some time. And then generative AI revolution happened. And everything was moving so fast that it was almost kind of pointless meeting because it was just moving so rapidly. But there's some really exciting developments that I'm keen to get into today.
Yeah. So to start then, Dexter, how do you sort of define AI? We all have our own view about what it is and what it might do. We've all played around with ChatGPT. What's your definition of AI?
Well, there's so much hype, right? And the reality is we bet trillions of dollars on this particular horse, and the horse is bolted. It's out there in the market. We have to turn that hype into action, and we really have to start using this as a tool to drive emissions reductions, to improve the quality of data that we have, and an efficiency tool, essentially. And a lot of us are actually using it. A lot of our teams are using it without any sort of structures or governance in place. So AI is really driving a huge amount of change in the economy already, whether we like it or not. And I think my message is to really take charge of that. We need to really use this as the greatest efficiency tool that we've ever seen. That will help us really target our efforts. We've spent a huge amount of time in this space just focusing on producing data, producing information, responding to reports. I've been seriously guilty of driving a lot of that from CDP over the years. But is that information actually being used? And that's what AI can help us do. It can help us target our efforts, sort of reduce some of the really mundane elements of our sustainability work, and really bring it back to what we originally got into this space for, which is actually driving action.
I want to dig into some examples then on how AI might be used. I run a weekly podcast, The Better Business Show. This week we're looking at a story with IBM partnering with L'Oreal and L'Oreal is using AI to train on a whole bunch of data to formulate new makeup products. And it's a really interesting example. And I wonder then, Dexter, what are the examples you have of companies that are using AI right now, and what benefit are they getting?
Yeah, I think broadly where I've seen it really make a difference is, and it's great that you mentioned Scope 3, but Scope 3 is obviously the big area where we can make a huge difference with AI. It's a really problematic area for a lot of organizations. 95% of the average company's emissions are actually in their supply chain, so it's a massive focus for us. We did some research with BCG and CDP back in 2022 that showed that we can reduce the level of effort required to gather Scope 3 emissions data by using artificial intelligence by 80%, while also increasing the accuracy of that data by 80%. So this is a really powerful tool to reduce the drudgery and the burden of gathering that information across the supply chain and actually focusing in on driving action. Then there's another area where we can use it, of course, is resource management, more efficient and effective resource management in organizations, and then risk mapping. We have huge amounts of weather data, huge amounts of information on the potential risks that will face us and our businesses as we move forward in a more climate-constrained world. AI can help us predict when those risks are going to hit us, where those risks are going to hit our supply chains. So incredibly powerful on that front. Just some concrete examples. It may not sound like a huge reduction, but we worked with a steel company a number of years ago. They reduced their emissions by 3% by deploying AI in the form of resource efficiency, helping them change how they approach their productions. We also saw a big metals and mining company reduce emissions, total emissions, and in the metals mining steel space, this is huge numbers, right? But by between 5 and 10%, they were able to reduce their energy consumption by a more efficient use of resources. All of that informed by AI.
Yeah. So AI seems to have gone from this sort of fringe, sort of techie topic to now, every boardroom's talking about how they're going to use it. How do you get started, particularly in sustainability and ESG? How do you actually get started with using it? What's your advice?
Well, I think the reality is probably a lot of your teams have already started using it. And I think rather a lot of people have been using it without any governance or controls in place. And that is a problem for businesses. I think we have to have a very deliberate approach to this. It has to come from the top. We have to make sure we manage risks associated with the deployment of AI, like inherent bias in the models. So we need to make sure that we're doing things like bias auditing of these things. But I think it starts at the top. We have to take a very deliberate approach about where we're going to deploy this, where we can see the most bang for our buck by deploying this. And I would say, this being pioneer in this space, but Scope 3, my God, that's the obvious starting point from where I'm sitting anyway. Because if you look into product level data, which is not terribly exciting right now, but it will become more and more important into the future. If we can use AI to help us target interventions across the life cycle of products, then we can really drive massive change. So I would say it's those tricky areas where there's huge amount of data that needs to be crunched, and we need to kind of identify those hotspots, use AI to improve the data quality, but also target the action in that space.
Sure. And can it be trusted? Or do we need to ramp up the levels of governance that you mentioned there?
Yeah, I think we are still at a bit of a Wild West stage. If you think about it, it is a bit like Scope 3 in many ways. It's right down in the supply chain. You don't know if your suppliers are using AI. You don't know how they're using AI. You don't know if your partners are using AI. You don't know how they're using AI. So again, it's like tracking Scope 3 emissions. How do we create good governance structures across our own organizations, but also across our supply chains, so that we actually have a good handle of where AI is used. Because otherwise there are, the possibility of inherent bias creeping through the models, and really bad decision making being happen. You have to have a human in the loop, absolutely critical. It's not a silver bullet, it's a force enabler, right? So we can't just go, okay, AI will handle that. We need to use it very deliberately to target our efforts.
Yeah. And the environmental impact of using AI cannot be ignored. So how do people work in sustainability teams square that one? How can they justify its use given the huge footprint?
Yeah, I mean, I started to get really quite depressed when I was thinking about AI and its impact on the energy grid, because at a base case, it's going to increase the demand on data centers by over 160% by 2030. In fact, in worst case scenario, it could erode all of our efforts to decarbonize the electricity grid if we don't use this tool properly. And that's part of the problem at the moment. There's this wide-scale deployment of various models that are actually using vast amounts of energy, but a lot of it is actually just people playing around with the tools, it's not deliberate use of the technology. If we deliberately use this technology, some estimates say that we can actually reduce emissions between now and 2030 by 20% across the economy. That's huge, right? But this question of energy consumption is massive. I'm actually a supporter of the modular nuclear, and a lot of the big tech companies are investing heavily in how that might be deployed. The good thing about these data centers is they're highly energy intensive, but they are big energy intensive things that you can work to decarbonize by putting local tools. So massive increase as always, like we always say, obviously, we start by increasing renewable capacity across the economy massively. I learned a couple of weeks ago that through Trump's first administration, 72% of all energy deployed in Trump 1 was renewable. Since he's been elected in November, 90% of all new energy capacity in the States is renewable, despite all the chat. Right? So the market is moving in that direction anyway. So between the deliberate and intelligent deployment of renewable and some other interventions like modular nuclear, I think we can crack it.
So you're saying if you're more deliberate about how you're going to use AI, it will far offset the environmental impact?
I think so. This is the data that we have that shows it already. The problem is, at the moment, it's just ad hoc people playing around with it, people cutting corners, bad preparations for meetings, that sort of thing. But it's not being deliberately deployed in a systematic way by companies. And there's a huge opportunity for the big consultants who, frankly, do have a challenge from AI. Certainly some of the lower level analysis work that would traditionally have been done by humans who are training. This is a massive risk to the economy, because how else do people learn those early stage analysis stuff that's going to be replaced by AI? Yeah. But they have an opportunity to help organizations deploy things with good governance structures, and build this out into their operations and actually use the data that's coming through from AI to actually make meaningful decisions. And that's what it's all about. If you go back to the ISSB requirements on Scope 3 reporting, it's called, they ask for decision useful Scope 3 data. And I think that's kind of what AI should get us to. Decision useful data, right? So yes, there's all the other stuff, and the models can churn that stuff, but let's bring the decision useful data to the fore so we can actually, as humans, take action and drive the change that we want to see.
Yeah. You've mentioned it a few times, the potential for solving the Scope 3 challenge? Is that where you see AI being most useful?
I mean, I have a total bias. I helped to write the original Scope 3 standard when I was back in CDP, started CDP supply chain work, so I've got a total bias on that. But it is one of the trickiest things in the sustainability space right now. It's one of the biggest challenges. It's also one of the greatest areas of opportunity. And if we can be more targeted about how we engage our supply chains, and not just kind of fetishize data collection, and actually really just go for gold and really drive the emissions reductions, that's where we need to be.
Yeah.
So I think it can really help us there.
Yeah.
But it's a massive tool for resource efficiency across the economy.
Yeah. Yeah. And it feels like we are at the very start of AI and what it might be used for in the future. What's the role for sort of regulation and policy and standards in this space, would you say?
Oh, well, you know, the EU has said it's going to have the EU AI Act that's moving forward. We have a rollback on any sort of interest in regulations from the United States. I think this sort of thing will settle. We require some degree of regulation on AI as we move into widespread deployment. It's quite important. So EU AI Act, and as often is the case, the EU will tend to lead the way in terms of regulating how this, and that will inform how other economies approach that. So I think there is need for regulation, and I think leaders and companies will anticipate that regulation.
Yeah. Going back to a question about how companies get started in using AI in sustainability or helping with ESG reporting or whatever it might be, there is some need, I guess, for people to experiment and play around with it. But going back to your point about the deliberate use of it being much better, how would you advise people get started in terms of, you know, where to go? Would they use a consultant? How would they do this?
Well, first of all, I used to tell people when they were approaching their supply chain, I was like, use crude secondary data to do a materiality assessment of your supply chain, and that will help you identify where your hotspots are, and then you can go after your key suppliers for primary data. You know, that was the message. I produced tons of reports saying exactly that, right? But I think my concern that I don't think the secondary data is as crude as it was because the AI tools that are driving this now are like massively increasing the accuracy. Right. And of course, they're feeding on 20, 30 years of LCA work, of carbon reporting, of primary data. So you're starting to get this really high quality data coming through. So I think it's definitely for that hot spotting, like step one. Use AI to help you across your supply chain to do that hot spotting. And then you can target using whatever tools that you have in your portfolio to really target those interventions with your key suppliers.
Yeah. And I noticed this year, Google announced that they pretty much used AI to write all of their sustainability report this year, which I don't know how people think about that. But is that where things are evolving to, particularly with reporting?
Yeah, I look, there is that message, right? But there's also quite a lot of people still working on reporting at Google, right? So that information will come through to the team, and they will then use that information and then report properly in the correct way. I don't see a point where you take humans out of the loop for things as important as corporate level reporting.
Yeah.
There will always be humans in the loop, I think.
Sure.
Yeah.
And stretched sustainability teams are just gasped at that comment. But
well, I think it's probably an intervention that came at the exact right time. If you think about the kind of bubble of activity that came around reporting coming up to CSRD, and then the kind of recoil after the omnibus came in, and everybody, and all that showed was that there was too much focus on reporting, too little focus on actually driving action. So I think this change is coming at the right time, and it will reduce the need for people digging through data manually, and will help to bring more actionable data insights to the fore. And that's a really positive thing. It means that sustainability teams will be freed up to actually do what they got into this space to do, which is save the planet, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that. And so then over the next sort of 3 to 5 years, how do you see things evolving and that use of AI evolving?
Yeah, I think this is going to become part of everybody's daily lives. I think the Microsoft has a good branding approach to this, the idea of a co-pilot. And I think that's a nice kind of way to think about how you use AI in your professional sphere. The problem is you can't have widespread deployment of the use of AI without some controls in place in a corporation. So leadership in corporations have to really get a handle on this. I think there should be more mandatory, I know this sounds frustrating, but there should probably be more mandatory reporting on the use of AI by companies in exactly the same way that we have ESG reporting writ large. We should be demanding more clear reporting from ISSB, CSRD on the use of AI, and that should be required in annual disclosures. And that will in turn force the company's leadership to take a more deliberate approach to the deployment of this.
Yeah. So what might that look like, that disclosure?
Not that dissimilar to carbon reporting over the years, right? I think in the early days, when we started asking companies at CDP to disclose CDP, there were some of the world's largest companies, they couldn't report scope 1, scope 2, so eventually they learned over time. There was a demand from their investors to disclose this type of information. Same exact thing will happen with AI. There will be a requirement from the market, from regulators to disclose what you're doing on this stuff. That will then inform more deliberate, strategic decision-making at the highest level in the organization. And the two will marry into something quite helpful, I think.
Yeah. So given the direction of travel, then, what should companies be preparing for right now?
Well, certainly they should stop being afraid of this. If you don't grab this bull by the horns, you're going to be left behind. We've already put trillions of dollars into this as a society. So if it doesn't work out, we're all going to lose our jobs anyway. So there's a big bet on this thing. It's already bolted. So I think it's more about, okay, how can I deliberately deploy this? How do I engage with senior levels in my organization? How do I build the governance structures that are required for any other business process? So I think that's really the next step. And I think we'll see that happen quite effectively and efficiently. I think the great thing about AI is that it is an efficiency driver. So I think it's really going to help us take the action we need to take in the economy on resource mapping, first and foremost, risk mapping, and then actually reducing our impact. So I think that's going to happen pretty quickly, actually.
Sure. Great stuff. Thank you, Dexter. Thanks for your time. In the interest of time, I know you've got time to get some coffee and get back to the next session. So please give up for Dexter. Thank you.